Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The Montana wilderness demanded a soul forged from iron and silence, and Abigail Finch was trying to build one swing of the axe at a time. In the waning light of late autumn, the sound of her labor was a lonely heartbeat in a vast, indifferent land, a sharp crack of steel on pine that echoed off the granite shoulders of the mountains before being swallowed by the endless sky. The half-built cabin behind her was more than a shelter. It was a fortress against the ghosts of a Boston life, a testament carved from the forest itself that she would not be broken. Each log she hoisted into place was heavier than the last, a punishing weight that added to the constant, growing burden of the child in her womb. She had chosen this isolated patch of earth for its promise of oblivion, a place where a woman's past could be buried under the snows of a hard winter. But the land kept its own counsel, holding secrets in its soil and its streams. And as the wind began to carry the first true bite of ice down from the peaks, a chill crawled over Abigail's skin that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the primal, unsettling feeling of being watched, not by the curious eyes of a deer or the distant gaze of an eagle, but by something far more calculating. She paused, axe in hand, her eyes scanning the dense, shadowy tree line. She had come here to fight the wilderness, but she was beginning to understand that the most dangerous predator in this valley walked on two legs, and it had been waiting for her. Stay with us, and witness a love forged in the heart of the unforgiving West. If this story touches your soul, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. Part 1. The Land of Echoes. The axe fell with a resonant thud, the sound shockingly loud in the vast silence of the Bitterroot Valley. Each swing sent a spray of pine-scented chips onto the needle-strewn earth, and with each, a sharp grunt escaped Abigail Finch's lips. The late autumn sun, already low in the sky, cast her shadow long and distorted against the half-formed skeleton of her cabin. Her face, smudged with dirt and sweat, was set in a mask of grim determination. Her knuckles were raw, her back ached with a fire that settled deep in her bones, and the child she carried low in her belly felt as heavy as the logs she wrestled into place. This land, cupped between the shoulders of looming mountains, was meant to be a sanctuary, a place to erase the past. But every echo of her axe striking timber felt like a defiance against the ghosts she'd fled from Boston, a declaration that she was still here, still fighting. She paused, resting her forehead against the cool, rough bark of a newly notched pine log. Her breath came in ragged clouds in the crisp air. Winter was a predator stalking the high peaks, its scent already on the wind, and she was in a desperate race against it. From a ridge overlooking the clearing, Silas Blackwood sat motionless on his buckskin gelding, the horse as still as its rider. He had been tracking a stray steer for the better part of the morning, but the rhythmic, solitary sound of an axe had drawn him off course. He'd expected to find a prospector, perhaps a trapper setting up a winter line. He did not expect to find a woman, alone and heavy with child, single-handedly raising a cabin from the valley floor. But more than the woman, it was the land itself that held his gaze, sending a familiar, bitter ache through his chest. This small parcel, with its clear-running creek and stand of old-growth pine, was a wound in his family's history. He could still hear his father's liquor-slurred apologies, still feel the shame that had settled over the Blackwood name the day this land was lost in a fool's poker game to Bartholomew Croft. For years, it had lain fallow, a reminder of a debt of honor he could never repay. And now, this woman was driving stakes into it, claiming it with a grit that both shamed and captivated him. He urged his horse forward, the quiet footfalls on pine needles announcing his approach. Abigail's head snapped up, her hand immediately going to the handle of the axe leaning against the wall. Her body tensed, a cornered animal ready to fight. She watched the rider emerge from the tree line, a tall man whose frame seemed to fill the space, his features shadowed by the brim of his hat. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands resting easy on the saddle horn. "Didn't mean to startle you, ma'am," Silas said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to calm the air. "Just following the sound. This is private land." Abigail's chin lifted. "It's my land," she stated, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear that fluttered in her heart. "Bought and paid for at the land office in Missoula. The deed is filed." Silas nodded slowly, his eyes moving from her swollen belly to the impressive, if unfinished, structure behind her. He saw the precision in the notchwork, the strength in the foundation. This was not the work of a fool. "My mistake," he said. "Name's Silas Blackwood. My family's ranch, the Circle B, borders this valley to the east." He saw no recognition in her eyes. She was new, then. Truly new. "Abigail Finch," she replied, offering nothing more. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of wind through the pines. "That's a considerable amount of work for one person," he finally ventured, gesturing with his chin toward the cabin. "Especially with winter closing in." "I'm aware of the season," she said, her tone sharp as frost. "And I've found my own 2 hands to be sufficient for the task." Silas felt a wry smile touch his lips, though he kept it from his face. The pride in her was as solid as the rock-strewn earth beneath them. It reminded him painfully of his late wife, Eliza, who would have sooner wrestled a bear than ask for help. But he also saw the deep exhaustion etched around her eyes, the slight tremble in the hand that still rested on the axe. This wasn't just pride, it was survival. "I'm not questioning your ability, Mrs. Finch, only offering a neighbor's hand. Those ridgepoles are heavy. I could have a few of my men help you set them before the first snow." Abigail's eyes narrowed. "I'm not in the market for charity, Mr. Blackwood, or pity." The words were a wall, and Silas knew better than to try and break it down. He saw the ghosts in her eyes, the history of a trust broken so badly she couldn't recognize a simple offer for what it was. He thought of Bartholomew Croft, of the man's insatiable greed. Croft likely didn't even know someone was on this patch of land he'd won and forgotten. But he would. Men like Croft had a nose for such things. "It's not charity," he said quietly. "It's just sense. The mountains here don't care much for pride. They care for preparation." He tipped his hat. "I'll leave you to your work, but the offer stands." He turned his horse, and without another word, rode back into the shadow of the trees. The image of her standing alone against the wilderness burned into his mind. Abigail watched him go, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't release the axe handle until he had completely vanished. A part of her screamed in relief at his departure, while another, smaller part felt a sharp pang of the solitude he had briefly interrupted. She shook her head, angry at her own weakness. She had come here to rely on no one but herself. She would not fail now. For the next week, she worked from dawn until her muscles screamed in protest at dusk. The walls rose higher, and she managed, through a grueling system of levers and sheer willpower, to haul the ridgepole into place. The small family of neighbors she had met, the Millers, had stopped by once with a loaf of bread and a warning about an early winter, their eyes full of a kindness that bordered on the pity she despised. She had thanked them politely and sent them on their way. She needed no one. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, she went to the creek for her last bucket of water for the day. She was humming softly, a half-remembered tune, when she noticed it. A slick, oily sheen swirled on the surface of the water near the bank, clinging to the rocks with a faint, chemical smell that wrinkled her nose. It wasn't pronounced, but it was undeniably there, an unnatural film on the otherwise pristine water. She knelt, dipping her fingers in and rubbing them together. Grease. Lamp oil, maybe? Her eyes scanned upstream. There were no other homesteads, no camps for miles. The creek flowed directly out of the mountains onto her land. This was no accident. A cold dread, colder than the icy water, washed over her. It was a message. A quiet, insidious warning that the predators in this valley didn't all walk on four legs. Someone had been here. Someone had deliberately tainted her only source of water. And as she stood there, the bucket forgotten in her hand, she looked at the dark, imposing silhouette of the mountains and realized, for the first time, that her fight was not just against the coming winter. She was not alone on this land, and whoever else was out there did not want her here. Part 2. The Alliance by the Creek. Sevens. For 2 days, Abigail fought a silent, losing war. She hauled water from further down the creek, boiling every drop over her fire until the pot was black with soot, a process that stole hours from her work and strength from her limbs. The greasy film in the water had dissipated, but the fear it had instilled lingered like a poison. Every snap of a twig in the woods sent her reaching for the axe. Every shadow seemed to hold the form of a man. The solitude that had once been her shield now felt like a cage, amplifying her vulnerability. On the third morning, she awoke to a new violation. A freshly painted wooden sign had been nailed to one of the large pines at the edge of her clearing. In stark, black letters, it read, "Property of B. Croft. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The audacity of it stole the air from her lungs. This was no longer a subtle warning. It was a declaration of ownership, a flag planted in her defiant world. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Swallowing the bitter taste of defeat, she abandoned her work and walked the miles to the edge of the Circle B ranch, her steps heavy with reluctance. She found Silas Blackwood mending a fence line, his movements practiced and efficient. He saw her coming from a long way off, and he straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply waited, his expression unreadable, as she recounted the story of the tainted water and the sign, her voice tight with a rage that barely masked her fear. He listened without interruption, his jaw tightening as she spoke. When she finished, he only nodded once. "Bartholomew Croft," he said, the name tasting like rust in his mouth. "He's a man who believes money can buy the law." He looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, and knew this was a fight she could not win alone. "I'll ride back with you," he said, and it was not an offer, but a statement of fact. The journey back to her cabin was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer empty, but filled with a shared, unspoken purpose. He found where the oil had been poured into the creek, a careless act meant only to intimidate. Together, they worked, Silas digging a small diversion channel to flush the contaminated section, while Abigail cleared the affected rocks. There was an easy rhythm to their shared labor, a nonverbal communication that grew as the day wore on. He seemed to know which tool she needed before she asked, and she had a canteen of fresh water ready for him before he realized his thirst. He was a man of quiet competence, his strength not just in his muscles, but in his steady, calming presence. He worked on her cabin with the same focus, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft as he showed her how to better brace the roof beams against the wind. He never took over, but worked alongside her, a partner rather than a savior. In the evenings, they would share a simple meal of biscuits and dried jerky by the fire, the flames pushing back the encroaching darkness. It was in these quiet moments that the walls between them began to crumble. He spoke of his late wife, Eliza, not with the sharp agony of fresh grief, but with a soft, lingering sadness. He described her wild laugh and her reckless love for fast horses, painting a picture of a life lived brightly and cut short too soon. In turn, Abigail found herself speaking of Boston, of the suffocating parlors and the brittle smiles, and of a man whose promises had turned to ash. She didn't name Theodore Vance, but she spoke of the deep betrayal of being abandoned, of being made to feel like a shameful secret. Silas listened, his gaze steady and full of a profound understanding that she had not encountered in another living soul. He saw not a fallen woman, but a survivor. The threats from Croft, however, did not cease. A week later, they found a line of newly driven survey stakes, marking out a plot that sliced directly through the foundation of her cabin. It was a lawyer's threat made with wood and iron, a cold, calculated move to undermine her claim. The sight sent a fresh wave of despair through Abigail, but Silas's reaction was different. It was a slow-burning anger. "This is his way," Silas said, his voice low. "He won't face you. He'll use paper and proxies to try and choke you out." That evening, the confrontation they had been expecting finally arrived. Two men, rough-looking ranch hands with the Circle C brand of the Croft Ranch on their saddles, rode into the clearing. They didn't dismount. The leader, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, spat a wad of tobacco near Abigail's feet. "Mr. Croft wants you to know you're on his land," the man drawled, his eyes roaming over Abigail's pregnant form with undisguised contempt. "He's given you fair warning. The sign, the stakes. Next warning won't be so polite. You've got till the first snow to be gone." Before Abigail could respond, Silas stepped forward, moving between her and the riders. He was unarmed, but his presence seemed to take up the entire clearing. "You're the ones trespassing. Boys," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is Mrs. Finch's property. Now, you deliver a message back to your boss for me. You tell him if he or any of his men set foot on this land again, they'll be dealing with the Blackwood family. All of it." The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty. The Blackwood name still carried weight in this valley. After a tense moment, he sneered, gathered his reins, and wheeled his horse around. "Your funeral, Blackwood," he spat, before riding off into the trees. The clearing fell silent again, but the air was charged, humming with the promise of a storm. The unspoken alliance had just been declared a public war. Part 3. The Public Divide. Sevens. Silas's declaration hung in the air long after the Croft riders had vanished, a line drawn not in the dust, but in the very fabric of their lives. The alliance forged by the creek was no longer a private arrangement. It was a public rebellion, and the consequences arrived sooner than either of them expected. It came not on horseback, but in a polished black carriage that seemed to suck the very light and color from the clearing. Isabella Croft stepped out, a vision of velvet and lace, her presence as alien in this rustic setting as a diamond in a handful of dirt. She did not look at the half-finished cabin with its rough-hewn logs, but at Abigail, her gaze sweeping over the worn dress and the undeniable swell of her belly with a cold, clinical disdain. Silas had placed himself in front of Abigail protectively, but Isabella's words bypassed him, sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel aimed directly at Abby. "So this is the noble cause," Isabella began, her voice dripping with a venomous sweetness. "The charity case that has my fiancé forgetting his name, his duty, and his promises." She took a delicate step forward, her silk skirts whispering over the pine needles. "You must be very proud, Miss Finch, to have so thoroughly bewitched a man of his standing. Tell me, is this a skill you learned in Boston, or is it a talent that desperate women naturally acquire?" Abigail felt the blood rush to her face, but before she could speak, Silas cut in, his voice a low growl. "Isabella, this has nothing to do with her. This is between you and me." Isabella finally turned her eyes to him, a flicker of genuine hurt warring with her calculated fury. "It has everything to do with her. The entire valley is whispering. They're calling you a fool, Silas, tying yourself to this. A woman with no name, carrying another man's bastard. You are dragging the Blackwood legacy through the mud for a stray." The word stray struck Abby harder than a physical blow. It was what she feared most, that, in his eyes, in everyone's eyes, she was nothing more than a burden he had inexplicably chosen to shoulder. But Silas did not flinch. "That child is not a bastard," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And this woman has more honor and strength in her little finger than you have ever known. Our engagement was a business arrangement, a merger of lands, and you know it. It had nothing to do with love." Isabella let out a brittle laugh. "Love? You think this backwoods fantasy is love? This is pity, Silas. A misplaced guilt over Eliza's death that you've projected onto the first damsel in distress you could find. But this damsel will be the ruin of you. My father will not stand for this public humiliation. He will see to it that this land is stripped from her, and he will see to it that your name is worthless in this territory." Her eyes, cold and hard, settled on Abby one last time. "Enjoy your champion while you can," she hissed. "When my father is done, he won't have a single thing left to offer you." The carriage departed as it had arrived, leaving a trail of dust and poisonous silence. The incident solidified a change in Silas. His help was no longer just a reaction to Croft's aggression, it became a proactive mission. He insisted that they could not hide. "Hiding is what he wants," Silas argued one evening, as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from a leaden sky. "It lets him control the story. The annual harvest dance is next week. We're going." The idea terrified Abby. To walk into a room full of people who were already judging her, to stand beside the man at the center of the valley's biggest scandal, it felt like marching into her own execution. Yet, as she looked at Silas, at the fierce conviction in his eyes, she saw that this was not just about her. It was about him reclaiming his own life from the shadows of grief and expectation. Reluctantly, she agreed. The night of the dance, the town hall was ablaze with lanterns and alive with the sound of fiddles and laughter. The moment Abigail and Silas stepped through the door, a wave of silence rolled through the room. The music faltered, the laughter died, and every eye turned to them. Whispers erupted like brushfire, and Abby could feel the weight of their stares like a physical force. She saw the members of the Miller family look away, their faces a mixture of sympathy and fear. This was Isabella's world, and she was the queen. She stood beside her father, Bartholomew Croft, a triumphant smile on her face. Croft, a broad, imposing man with eyes like chips of granite, watched them with undisguised contempt. They endured the ostracism for an hour, Silas's hand a warm, steady presence on the small of her back, a silent anchor in a sea of hostility. Then, the music stopped for the main event. The charity auction to raise money for a new church bell. Bartholomew Croft, as the town's wealthiest benefactor, took the stage. He spoke of community, of decency, of upholding moral standards. And then, his eyes found Silas and Abby. "We give what we can to build up this community," Croft boomed, his voice filling the hall. "But a community is only as strong as its character. It is weakened when honorable men are led astray, when sacred promises are broken, and when trespassers with questionable histories attempt to lay claim to what is not theirs." The accusation was clear. A murmur went through the crowd. This was it, the public trial. Abby felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to flee. But Silas's hand tightened, holding her in place. Then, he let go and walked toward the stage. He did not ask for permission. He simply stood beside Croft, facing the silent, watching town. "Mr. Croft speaks of character," Silas began, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "So let's talk about it. He speaks of trespassers. So let's talk about the land Mrs. Finch is on. He calls it his. But I wonder how many of you know how he came to own it." He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "He won it. From my father. In a late-night poker game fueled by whiskey and grief, not long after my mother passed. He won it from a man in mourning, a shameful victory he has held over my family's head for 20 years. A collective gasp went through the assembly. The story was old, but never spoken of so openly. "That is the honorable claim he has to that land," Silas continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "Now, Abigail Finch is building a home there. Not with a stacked deck of cards, but with her own 2 hands. She is building a future for her child, with more honesty and sweat than some men will ever know. If that is trespassing, then honor has lost its meaning in this valley." He then turned, his eyes finding Isabella in the crowd. "And as for sacred promises," he said, his voice softening but losing none of its power, "a promise made for the wrong reasons is not sacred. It is a cage. And I will no longer live in it. Before all of you, I am officially ending my engagement to Miss Croft. My future, whatever it may hold, lies with Mrs. Finch." The silence that followed was absolute, a deafening void where a world had just been shattered and a new one declared. Bartholomew Croft's face was a mask of purple rage. Isabella's was ashen with shock and humiliation. And Abigail, standing alone in the crowd, felt tears streaming down her face, not of shame, but of a profound, heart-stopping gratitude. The line had been drawn. The war was now in the open. Part 4. The Ghost from the Past. Sevens. The ride back from town was a journey through a new world, one they had created with a few hundred spoken words. The silence in the wagon was no longer one of caution or discovery, but of gravity. Every creak of the wheels on the frozen road, every soft snort from the horse, seemed magnified in the vast, star-dusted quiet of the Montana night. Abigail sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket Silas had provided, but the warmth did not reach the tremor deep inside her. She replayed the scene at the dance over and over. The collective gasp of the crowd, the venom in Bartholomew Croft's eyes, the ashen shock on Isabella's face. But most of all, she saw Silas, standing tall and unwavering, sacrificing his reputation, his fortune, and his future for her. The gratitude she felt was so immense, it was painful, tangled inextricably with a crushing guilt. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. "You've ruined yourself. For me." Silas didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, but his voice was firm. "Ruin? Abby, for the first time in 5 years, I feel like I'm building something instead of just patching up old fences. My life with the Crofts wasn't a future. It was a tomb I was letting them build around me. Tonight, I walked out of it." He pulled the wagon to a stop as they reached the clearing, the half-finished cabin looking like a sturdy, defiant shadow in the moonlight. He turned to her then, his gaze intense. "There is no ruin here. There's just this. What we're building. That's all that matters." But in the opulent parlor of the Croft mansion, Bartholomew was proving that other things still mattered. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, his hand as steady as iron, while Isabella paced the room like a caged panther, her ball gown a silken swirl of fury and humiliation. "He made a fool of me, Father," she raged. In front of everyone. Bartholomew handed her a glass. "Stop wailing, Isabella. Public opinion is a fickle thing. It changes with the weather. The law, however, is a fortress." He took a sip of his brandy, his mind already churning. "Blackwood thinks he has won a moral victory. We will show him that morality is a pauper's currency. There is another player in this game." He walked to his mahogany desk and pulled out a telegraph form. "Silas has built his entire defense on the honor of that woman. We will shatter that foundation." He began to write, the pen scratching decisively across the paper. "We will bring a ghost back from Boston. A legal, binding ghost." The telegram was sent the next morning. And for a few weeks, an unnatural calm settled over the valley. The snows came, blanketing the world in a pristine, quiet white. The town remained divided. Some offered Silas curt nods of respect, others crossed the street to avoid him. But no one dared to make a move. This quiet period was a gift. It allowed the raw, public wounds to scar over, and in the shelter of the nearly completed cabin, something real and beautiful began to grow between Abby and Silas. They worked side by side, their movements now a familiar dance. He taught her how to properly chink the logs with a mixture of mud and moss to seal out the wind, and she showed him the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly kneaded loaf of bread baked in their new stone hearth. The cabin was no longer just her project, it was their shared dream. He built a sturdy cradle, carving the image of a soaring eagle into the headboard. In the evenings, he would read to her from a worn book of poetry, his deep voice a comforting rumble against the howl of the winter wind. One night, as they sat before the fire, he finally spoke of the day Eliza had died, of the terrible silence after the fall, of the guilt that had consumed him for years, a guilt for not being able to protect her from her own wild spirit. "For 5 years," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought love was just another word for loss. I was afraid to feel anything, because I thought it would eventually be ripped away. But you're not afraid of anything, are you?" Abby looked at the fire, her hand resting on her belly, where a flutter of movement reminded her of the new life within. "I'm afraid all the time," she confessed softly. "But I've learned that being afraid and giving up are 2 different things." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Then we'll be afraid together." It was in that moment, in the warmth of the firelight, that she finally allowed herself to believe that this was real, that she might actually be allowed to keep this fragile happiness. The arrival of the ghost was as quiet as the falling snow. A man stepped off the noon stagecoach in town, a man in a fine wool coat and polished city shoes that were wholly unsuited for the muddy, frozen streets of a Montana town. His name was Theodore Vance. He was handsome in a way that seemed weak and untested, his face clean-shaven, his hands soft. He took a room at the hotel and then had a long, private meeting with Bartholomew Croft. The deal was simple. Croft would pay all of Vance's expenses and provide him with a handsome sum of money. All Vance had to do was play the part of the aggrieved, repentant husband. Theodore, whose finances were in a ruinous state, readily agreed. A few days later, he rode a rented horse out to Abby's cabin. She was outside, gathering firewood, when she saw him. Her blood ran cold. The axe handle slipped from her numb fingers and fell silently into the snow. It was him. The man who had smiled at her in a Boston church and called her his wife, and then had looked at her with disgust and called her a liar. He dismounted, a rehearsed look of sorrow on his face. "Abigail," he said, his voice soft, "I've been looking for you for months." Silas emerged from the cabin, sensing the change in the air, and stopped dead when he saw the stranger, and the look of pure terror on Abby's face. "What do you want?" Silas asked, his voice flat and hard as stone. Vance ignored him, his eyes fixed on Abby. "I was a fool, my dear. A terrified, arrogant fool. To think I could have ever doubted you, or our child." He took a step closer, his gaze dropping to her belly. "I've come to take you home, to take my family home." Abby found her voice, a choked whisper. "You have no family here. You gave up that right." Theodore's expression hardened slightly. "According to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I have every right. We are still husband and wife, are we not?" He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, their marriage certificate. "I've come to correct my mistake, to be the husband and father I should have been." Silas moved to stand beside Abby, a formidable, unmovable wall. "She's not going anywhere with you." For the first time, Vance addressed him directly. "You must be Mr. Blackwood, the man who has taken my wife under his protection. Mr. Croft told me all about your noble gestures." He smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "But your charity ends now. I am here to reclaim what is legally mine." He looked back at Abby, his voice dropping to a tone of false sympathy. "Don't make this difficult, Abigail. I am giving you a choice. You can come with me now, and we can put this unfortunate chapter behind us. Or you can force my hand. I will file a petition in the territorial court. I will sue for the restoration of my marital rights and for custody of my legal heir. It will be a very public, very ugly affair. Your name, your child's legitimacy, all of it will be laid bare. Is that what you want for the man who has rescued you? To see his name forever linked to an adulteress? The threat hung in the frozen air, a perfect, inescapable trap. He had them. With Croft's money and the full force of the law on his side, he could destroy everything they had started to build. Chapter Part 5. A Heart in the Blizzard. Sevens. Theodore Vance's ultimatum left a poison in the air, a silence so profound that the crackle of the fire sounded like splintering bones. Abigail stood rigid, her hands pressed against the small of her back as if to hold herself together. The life she had so painstakingly built felt like a house of cards, and the ghost from her past had just blown it all down. "I'll go with him," she said, her voice a dead, hollow thing. She turned to Silas, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "It's the only way. He wants the land, not me. I'll sign whatever he wants. He can have it. If I go, he has no reason to pursue you, no reason to drag you and your name into a court battle you can't win. It's over, Silas. He's won." Silas crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders with a gentle but unyielding firmness. "No," he said, his voice a low, fierce rumble. "We don't run. We don't surrender. Do you think I did what I did at the dance just to watch you walk away with him? That man is a coward and a bully, using a piece of paper to threaten what he doesn't have the courage to build himself. I don't care about the law he's hiding behind, and I don't care about the names he'll call me. This is our home, Abby. That is our child, and I will not lose you." His words were a firebrand in the cold despair of her heart, but the fear was too deeply rooted. Before she could argue further, a sudden, violent gust of wind rattled the cabin door, and the sky outside began to darken with an unnatural, bruised purple hue. A blizzard was coming, a monster descending from the peaks. Silas looked out the small window, his jaw set. "I have to go to town," he said, his voice urgent. "I need to get more supplies before this hits, and I'm going to talk to Sheriff Miller. He's a decent man. He might not be able to fight Croft's lawyers, but he won't stand for intimidation." He pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, his movements swift and decisive. "Bar the door behind me. I'll be back before the worst of it hits. I promise." He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss full of unspoken promises and fierce resolve, and then he was gone, swallowed by the first flurries of snow. The moment he disappeared, the true terror of her isolation closed in. The wind began to shriek, a living entity clawing at the walls. And then, the first pain hit her. A sharp, clenching fire low in her belly that stole her breath and sent her staggering against the table. It couldn't be. It was too soon. But another contraction, stronger this time, answered her. The stress, the fear, the confrontation, it had all been too much. The baby was coming. At that same moment, 3 riders were pushing their horses through the thickening snow toward the cabin. Bartholomew Croft, Theodore Vance, and one of the hired thugs from before. The storm was their cover, a perfect accomplice to their final move. "She's alone," Croft yelled over the wind. "Blackwood has gone to town. We'll have her and her signature on a quitclaim deed before he even knows what's happened." Theodore looked unnerved by the sheer violence of the weather, but his greed was stronger than his fear. Inside, Abby fought a two-front war. A wave of agony would crash over her, and in the brief, gasping moments of peace that followed, she would drag a heavy chest in front of the door and slide the iron bar into place. She grabbed the axe, its weight a familiar, grim comfort in her hands. She was a cornered animal, and her only instinct was to protect the life fighting its way into the world. The riders arrived, their dark forms barely visible through the swirling white. They saw the barred door, and Croft's face twisted in rage. "Break it down!" he ordered the hired man. Miles away, Silas was fighting his own battle. The world had vanished into a blinding, suffocating whiteness. The trail was gone, the landmarks erased. He was navigating by pure instinct, the promise he'd made to Abby, a solitary beacon in the roaring blizzard. Suddenly, a figure on horseback loomed out of the snow, the second of Croft's men, sent to intercept him. The man lunged, attempting to pull Silas from his horse. The two men fell, crashing into a deep snowdrift, a tangle of limbs and curses. They fought with a raw, desperate brutality, their punches muffled by the snow and the wind. Silas, driven by a love that was more powerful than any hired muscle, finally slammed the man's head against a frozen log, leaving him stunned and half-buried in the snow. He scrambled back to his horse and pushed on, his face bloody, his lungs burning, his heart screaming Abby's name. The first splintering crack of wood at the cabin door coincided with a scream torn from Abby's throat. The hired man was using a log as a battering ram. The door shuddered, the wood groaning in protest. Abby lay on the furs by the hearth, her body slick with sweat, every muscle screaming as the child fought to be born. She was losing strength. The door was about to give. And then, through the howl of the wind, she thought she heard a shout. The battering stopped. She heard a man's cry of pain, the sickening thud of fists on flesh. With one last, monumental effort, as the world around her faded to a roaring tunnel of pain, she pushed. Just as the cabin door flew inward, torn from its hinges, a new sound pierced the storm, the raw, piercing cry of a newborn baby. Silas stood in the doorway, a fearsome apparition of snow and blood, his chest heaving. The hired man lay unconscious in the snow. Bartholomew Croft was scrambling backward, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. And Theodore Vance, his fine city coat splattered with snow, stared at the scene with wide, terrified eyes. He saw Silas, a man who had fought through a blizzard and a man to be with this woman. He heard the cry of the child, a sound so real and powerful it made his legal papers seem like pathetic, flimsy lies. And in that moment, the ghost from Boston was finally broken. Silas, ignoring the other men, stumbled into the cabin. His eyes found Abby, pale and exhausted, but with a fierce, triumphant light in her eyes. She was holding a small, blanket-wrapped bundle to her chest. Their gazes locked across the room, a universe of pain, fear, and love passing between them. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the small, battered cabin, against all odds, their family had just been born. Part 6. The home named Dawn. Sevens. The howl of the blizzard outside was a defeated, dying beast, its fury no match for the profound, sacred silence that had fallen within the four walls of the cabin. Silas knelt beside the hearth, his bruised knuckles forgotten as he gently washed the newborn baby with a warm, damp cloth. He was clumsy, his large hands accustomed to reins and ropes, not the delicate limbs of his son, but he moved with a reverent tenderness that brought tears to Abigail's eyes. She lay on the furs, exhausted but awake, her heart a symphony of relief, awe, and a love so fierce it felt like it could hold the fractured roof together. Outside, in the swirling snow, the final act of the failed war played out in pathetic whispers. Bartholomew Croft, his face a mask of utter defeat, hauled a whimpering Theodore Vance to his feet. The hired man was already gone, having fled into the storm the moment the fight had turned. Croft looked at the cabin, at the sturdy figure of Silas visible in the doorway, and for the first time in his life, he knew he had encountered a force that his money could not bully and his influence could not break. He had lost. He dragged Vance away, the ghost from Boston vanishing back into the obscurity from which he came, his legal papers and empty threats now meaningless against the primal truth of the scene he had just witnessed. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was reborn in blinding white, the sun glittering on a pristine, silent landscape. The first visitors were not a threat, but a tentative offering of peace. Sheriff Miller and a somber-looking Mr. Miller arrived on horseback, their faces etched with shame and concern. They brought a crate of supplies, canned milk, flour, salted meat, and a bundle of warm blankets knitted by Mrs. Miller. "We heard," the sheriff said, his eyes not quite meeting Silas's. "We should have done more. A man's legal papers. They seemed more solid than a man's character." "We were wrong." Silas simply nodded, accepting the apology and the supplies. It was the beginning of the thaw, not just of the snow, but of the community's heart. News of that night spread through the valley like a slow-moving fire, a story of courage, brutality, and the birth of a child in the heart of a blizzard. The tale painted Bartholomew Croft not as a powerful landowner, but as a cruel bully, and Silas Blackwood not as a fool, but as a hero. The spring that followed was a time of healing and rebuilding. A letter, bearing a Boston postmark, arrived for Abby. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were the official, signed, and stamped divorce decrees. A short, clipped note from a lawyer informed her that Mr. Vance had relinquished all claims and would not trouble her again. Silas had found him in a hotel in Helena, given him enough money to ensure he would disappear forever, and made it clear that a return to Montana would be his final mistake. The ghost was exorcised, not by law, but by a quiet, frontier justice. The matter of the land was settled with similar finality. Silas rode to the Croft mansion, not as a supplicant, but as a buyer. He placed a pouch of gold coins on Bartholomew's polished desk, more than fair market value for the disputed parcel. It was not a plea, but a transaction. He was not asking for the land. He was taking it, redeeming his father's loss not with anger, but with strength and honor, closing a painful chapter in his family's history forever. The cabin, with its broken door and scarred walls, became a symbol of their survival. But they did not have to rebuild it alone. One bright Saturday morning, a procession of wagons appeared in the clearing. The Millers, the sheriff, and a dozen other families from the valley had arrived with hammers, saws, and baskets of food. It was a cabin raising, a communal act of rebuilding that was as much an apology as it was a celebration. They repaired the door, built a wide, welcoming porch, and raised a small, sturdy barn next to the creek. The sound of hammers echoed through the valley once more, but this time it was not a lonely sound of defiance, but a chorus of community. Abby, holding her son, moved among them, offering water and slices of apple cake, no longer the proud, isolated stranger, but a woman who had earned her place through fire and ice. They named the baby Samuel. There was no formal christening in a church. Instead, one sun-drenched afternoon, they stood by the creek, the water now running clear and pure. With the Millers as their witnesses, Silas held his son as Abby dipped a hand in the cool water and touched it to the baby's forehead. It was their own ceremony, a quiet dedication of their son to the land that had tested them and ultimately given them a home. It was, in its own way, their wedding, a vow made not with rings, but with roots that now ran deep into the rich Montana soil. Months passed. Summer came to the valley, painting the meadows with wildflowers and warming the pine-scented air. The cabin was complete, a handsome, solid home with blue curtains in the windows and a climbing rose just beginning to snake its way up the porch railing. One evening, as dusk settled like a soft, lavender-hued blanket over the mountains, Abigail sat in a rocking chair on the porch, the gentle creak a peaceful rhythm in the quiet air. Samuel slept in the cradle Silas had built, his tiny chest rising and falling in the last light of day. She looked out at the land, at the mended fences and the dark, rich soil of a new garden. The echoes were gone, replaced by the soft whisper of the wind and the distant lowing of Circle B cattle. She saw a rider approaching, and her heart lifted. It was Silas, returning not from a fight, but from a day's work. He dismounted and walked up the steps, his face tired but content. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that tasted of dust, sweat, and home. He looked from her face to their sleeping son, and then out at the valley, now theirs. "It's a good place," he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder, as if seeing it all for the first time. "It's more than good," Abby replied softly, her hand finding his. "It's a beginning." He smiled, squeezing her hand. "Every beginning needs a name. What should we call it?" Abby looked at the eastern peaks, where the first light of day always appeared, the light that had broken through the darkness of the blizzard on the morning their son was born. "I know a name," she said, her voice full of a peaceful certainty. "We'll call it Dawn's Landing, because this is where the dawn finally found us." The story of Abigail Finch and Silas Blackwood began with a single, lonely sound, the echo of an axe in a vast wilderness. It was the sound of a woman building a wall against the world, believing that strength meant standing alone. But what their journey has taught us is that a home is not truly built until its doors are opened to another. It is not constructed from wood and stone, but from shared burdens, whispered truths in the firelight, and the courage to stand for someone when the rest of the world stands against them. Their love was not a gentle, easy thing found in a quiet meadow. It was forged in the heart of a blizzard, tested by greed and violence, and earned through sacrifice. It reminds us that sometimes the most profound strength is found in the moment we finally allow someone to help us carry the weight we thought was ours alone to bear. This cabin, this family, this home named Dawn's Landing, is a testament to the fact that even after the longest, darkest, and coldest of nights, a new day is not only possible, but inevitable, if you have someone to watch the sunrise with. If you believe that the strongest foundations are built from trust and that true love is a shelter against any storm, then please like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope can be found in the most unexpected places. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories and join our community, because every frontier, past and present, is filled with hearts fighting for their own dawn. We'll be waiting for you right here with another story.